The first time she saw me, she stopped moving entirely. Not the way prey stops, not the flinch of something that has realized too late that it has made an error. She stopped the way a machine stops when a technician pulls the wrong wire, total, instantaneous, and wrong in a way that had nothing to do with fear. I didn't understand it then. I'm not sure I fully understand it now. But I know what happened between that moment and this one, and I know why her war captains are still arguing about it in whatever dark council they hold. And I know that somewhere in their translated archives there is a single phrase that keeps appearing, repeated in 17 different dialects of their language, which their own linguists have rendered in standard as, "The world should not have made this." Let me tell you what they found when they came here. My name is Darius Akefer. I was 39 years old when the Veth arrived. I had been at various points in my life, a combat medic in the 3rd Sahel campaign, a trauma surgeon at a field hospital in what used to be called the Carpathian Corridor, a prisoner for 11 months in a detention facility whose operators were later tried for war crimes, and for the last 4 years before first contact, a very quiet man who lived in a very small house on the edge of a forest in what was once northern Finland, where I cut wood, raised a half-wild dog named Kepi, and made a reliable pot of coffee every morning at 5 a.m. before watching the light change across the tree line. I was not the right person to represent humanity to an interstellar species. I was, however, the only person present. But I should back up further than the day the Veth arrived, because the day the Veth arrived is only the beginning of this story, and the beginning is not the important part. The important part is everything that happened to me before, and why those things, when stacked together in the order they occurred, produced something that no alien species in 4,000 years of contact had encountered. The Sahel campaign lasted 3 years. I was 24 when I signed on, idealistic in the way that people who have spent a long time in medical training can be idealistic, which is to say that I understood, intellectually, that the world was cruel, but I had not yet understood it in my body. The campaign disabused me of the intellectual understanding. What replaced it was not cynicism, which would have been cleaner. It was something more granular, a precise, detailed knowledge of the specific ways a human body can be damaged and still keep going, a knowledge I had learned from the inside of other people's suffering, and from the outside of my own hands doing work that was never quite enough and was still, always, the difference between someone living and not living. You learn things in those spaces. You learn that the body has a stubbornness that the mind does not understand until the mind is forced to work through it. You learn that people persist through things they have no business persisting through, and that this persistence is not strength in any conventional sense. It is more like a refusal that doesn't know it's refusing. After the campaign, I went to the field hospital in the corridor. The corridor, for those who don't know the geography, was a strip of contested territory 300 kilometers long and in places less than 40 kilometers wide, caught between 3 competing forces, none of which had international recognition, and all of which were adequately funded by interests that had strong reasons not to be named. The hospital operated in a legal gray zone. We treated combatants and civilians and children, and sometimes all 3 in the same family. And we operated under an informal understanding with all 3 forces that was never written down, and was violated routinely and held, because the alternative was losing the only medical facility in 300 kilometers. I was there for 4 years before the informal understanding broke down in the specific, catastrophic way that informal understandings break down, which is all at once in the middle of the night, with no warning except the warning you had been ignoring. They took the hospital in February. I was taken with it. The 11 months in the facility are not something I talk about in any extended way, not because I have agreed to keep silent about them. The tribunal used my testimony, but because the specific details are not the part that matters for this story. What matters is the nature of what was done, which was systematic and which had a clear objective, the dissolution of the self, the breaking of the particular membrane that separates a person from an animal from a body, that which insists on being an I rather than an it. They were very good at their work. A lot of people who went through it did not come out the other side as a recognizable self. I came out the other side as something I still don't have a complete name for. The psychiatrists who evaluated me at the tribunal used phrases like dissociative adaptation, threat response reorganization, and in one particularly careful report, post-traumatic structural resilience, which sounds like a compliment and is not exactly a compliment. What they were describing in clinical language is that the I had survived by agreeing to become something else. Not broken, not destroyed. Reorganized the way a city reorganizes around a disaster. The streets are different. Some buildings are gone. The map you had before no longer matches the terrain, but it is still a city, still functioning, still inhabited. I went to Finland because I needed somewhere quiet, and because the friend who had rented the house before me had left and said I could use it. I stayed because Kepi needed someone, and I needed something to be needed by. I stayed because the forest was honest in a way that humans have difficulty being, operating on rules that don't pretend to be anything other than what they are, and I found that restful. I stayed because I was 48 hours from anywhere anyone wanted anything from me, and that was the precise distance I needed to keep the corridor at a manageable remove. 4 years, coffee, wood, dog, the light on the trees. And then the Veth arrived. The Veth arrived in what the news services, for about 40 hours, called a dispersal event. 17 objects entered the atmosphere simultaneously across 11 continents. The objects were not weapons. They were not ships, not exactly. The Veth themselves do not use the word ship the way we use it. They use a term that translates roughly as carried house, something that moves but also shelters, something alive in a way that sits between biology and architecture. 17 carried houses, each roughly the size of a city block, came down in remote locations. 3 in the Arctic, 2 in deep desert, 1 in ocean shallows, the rest in forests, tundra, high plateau. 1 came down 40 kilometers north of my house. The first reports were confused. The first images were worse. The Veth are tall, between 2 and 3 meters, built along lines that suggest something evolved for open, treeless terrain, with long limbs adapted for both reach and speed, a torso that carries internal organs in a configuration that puts nothing vital where a human would put it, and a face that is not a face but a cluster of sensory organs arranged in a faintly radial pattern. They are not ugly. That is the wrong word. They are simply organized around a completely different set of priorities than a human body, and the brain, seeing them, has to work very hard to find a reference frame. Most people, seeing a Veth for the first time, describe a feeling like vertigo, not terror. Just the sudden, nauseating sensation that something you assumed was fixed, the basic shape of a living thing, is actually an assumption you never knew you were making. The Veth are also, I would learn, extremely deliberate. They do nothing without purpose. They do not waste motion. They do not waste words. When they came out of their carried houses, they came in formation, and the formation had a name and a meaning and a history going back. We would later discover something like 4,000 of their years. They had done this before. On many worlds, the formation meant, we have arrived to assess and, if warranted, to claim. Nobody knew that in the first 72 hours. What we knew was that they were here and that they were large and that they carried weapons and that our orbital defense platforms, which had taken 30 years and most of the global infrastructure budget to build, had been neutralized in the 40 seconds between atmosphere entry and landing. Not destroyed. Neutralized, which, someone in the emergency briefing I was watching on a satellite phone said, meant that whoever these things were, they were better than us at the technology we had specifically built to stop things like them. The global response was predictable and largely useless. Governments broadcast signals, scientists broadcast signals, religions broadcast signals. 3 separate militaries fired things at the landed carried houses, and the things bounced off or disappeared before impact in ways that implied the Veth found the gesture mildly insulting. 7 independent attempts at physical contact were made. Of those 7, 2 ended in the death of the humans involved. 2 ended in the humans being returned to within sight of their governments in states of obvious psychological distress. 2 produced no response at all from the Veth. And 1, an agricultural researcher named Yuki Tanaka, who had the extraordinary misfortune and extraordinary luck of being inside the perimeter of the Greenland landing site when the carried house came down, produced the first extended communication. Yuki Tanaka was not diplomatic, she was a biologist. She treated the Veth the way she would have treated any large organism she didn't yet understand, which is to say she was careful, she was methodical, she observed before she spoke, and when she finally did speak, she was honest in a way that a diplomat would not have been. She told them, "We are afraid of you, and we do not know what you want, and these are the 2 most important things I can think to say." The Veth had, apparently, not encountered that combination before. Most species, they told Tanaka through a medium we still don't fully understand, a kind of resonant field that carried both sound and meaning simultaneously, either attacked or submitted. A species that could articulate its own fear without collapsing into either response was something they needed to assess more carefully. Assessment for the Veth meant challenge. I found out about the challenge the same way most people found out, through the emergency broadcast system, which had been repurposed into something between a news service and a horror story, cycling the same 40 minutes of footage and translation on every accessible channel. The Veth had issued a formal declaration through Tanaka, who looked like she had aged a decade in 4 days, but was holding herself upright by the spine of her own professionalism. She read the declaration in her own words, not the Veth's, because she said their phrasing was too precise and the precision would be misleading. The Veth offered a single combat, their champion against a human champion. The outcome would determine whether they considered humanity worth preserving as a client species, which was their word for something between a subordinate and an experiment, or whether humanity was what they called unresolvable, which Tanaka translated carefully as not meaning extermination, but meaning abandonment, the withdrawal of Veth interest, which might or might not mean the same thing given how thoroughly they had already demonstrated their ability to neutralize our defense infrastructure. Tanaka added her own observation. The Veth were not doing this because they respected us. They were doing it because it was their procedure. They had a process. They followed it. The challenge was not a gesture of honor. It was bureaucratic. That somehow was the most frightening thing she said. The champion they sent was named in their language, something that translated as a long phrase about killing and certainty. Tanaka shortened it to Keth for the broadcast. Keth was, by the standards of even Veth physiology, large. She, and I use she because the Veth use a gendered system that isn't precisely equivalent to ours, but the closest mapping puts Keth in the feminine, stood somewhere between 2.5 and 3 meters. She had fought, the declaration said, on 9 worlds. She had never lost a challenge. She had been built for this in ways that were both biological and chosen, the way that a human might have a natural predisposition for something, and then spend decades refining it into an edge. She carried a weapon that Tanaka described as a length of crystallized force, not a blade exactly, more a shaped field that cut by redirecting whatever it touched. It hummed at a frequency below hearing. It threw a faint shadow in directions that didn't match the light. She moved with the particular economy of something that has never been threatened, the ease of the very top of a very long predatory chain. The Veth gave us 72 hours to produce a champion. 90 people volunteered in the first hour, military, ex-military, martial artists. One Olympic javelin thrower who had apparently thought this through more than most. The selection committee, convened in emergency session, spent 36 of the 72 hours arguing. A psychologist on the committee made the point that the selection criterion was wrong, that they were selecting for combat effectiveness against a human opponent, which told them nothing about how to face something that didn't fight like a human. She was overruled. The committee selected a man named Alexei Volkov, a former Special Forces operator with a record that read like a novel somebody had decided not to publish because nobody would believe it. Volkov was 46, in extraordinary condition, and had the composed, slightly distant manner of someone who had learned long ago to keep their internal weather hidden. He had volunteered. He had been the first to volunteer. When the camera found him in the staging area, he was sitting with his hands on his knees, eyes closed, breathing. He looked ready. He looked like the right choice. He died in 11 seconds. Not because he was slow, not because he was underskilled. He was, from what I saw on the broadcast, doing everything correctly by every measure of human combat training. He moved well. He read the initial attack correctly. He countered. But the Veth don't fight by human logic, and Keth, specifically, had spent the rough equivalent of 30 years learning to take the thing a human body does when it tries to survive and make it into a doorway. She didn't overpower him. She redirected him. Twice. And then she used the third redirect to end it. Tanaka, watching from 50 meters away, said later that Keth didn't appear to be trying. The second champion was an Indonesian Marine named Renasuzilo, who had done 3 tours in the island conflicts and had a reputation, her commanding officer said, for creative problem solving under pressure. She lasted 43 seconds, which the broadcast commentary treated as an improvement. She managed to strike Keth once, a blow to what would be the shoulder region on a human, which Veth physiology maps roughly to, and Keth paused for perhaps 2 seconds after, which some people later called a flinch and which I thought, watching it, looked more like recalibration, like an update being applied. Renasuzilo was not killed. She was set aside, carefully, in a way that looked almost gentle, and Keth stepped back into the center of the challenge space and waited. The Veth gave us 48 more hours. There was a third champion, a Chinese fighter, former military, who had fought professionally for a decade after discharge. He was precise and technically brilliant and lasted 67 seconds, which became the statistic that people repeated as though it meant something. He got close enough to read the weapon's harmonic signature with instruments wired into his suit and relay it back to the scientific team, which was the actual mission. Nobody expected him to win. They just wanted the data. He knew that. He had agreed to it. He walked in carrying a flask of something that smelled like good baijiu, took a single drink at the edge of the challenge space, and passed the flask to his second with a small, particular smile that the cameras caught. He didn't come back out. But he came back, and the data he sent was the beginning of what I used. The Veth gave us another 48 hours. I found out I was being considered on day 6 through a communication from the Finnish Defense Forces that arrived on my satellite phone in the form of a text message, which struck me as both appropriate and slightly absurd. The message was formal. It asked whether I was Darius Akaffer, formerly of the International Field Surgical Corps, formerly of the Sahel Campaign, formerly of Detention Facility Bravo 7 in the Carpathian Corridor. It confirmed my current location. It asked whether I had received the broadcasts regarding the Veth Challenge. I'd watched all of them. I'd watched them the way I watched everything since the corridor, the way you watch something when you know that the thing you're seeing is going to matter and you're not yet sure how. Careful, quiet. From a distance, Kepi had been agitated for days, picking up something in the air that I was only catching the edges of, the displaced wildlife, the particular silence a forest makes when something large and wrong has moved into its borders. I replied to the message, yes, and what do you need? What they needed, it turned out, was complicated to explain. The man who called me the next morning was not military. He was a linguist who had been part of the team working with Tanaka. His name was Imre. He spoke quickly, with the energy of someone who had not slept in several days and was surviving on caffeine and the specific, uncomfortable clarity that comes after. He said, "We've been studying the challenge records. Every challenge the Veth have issued, on every world we can document. There's a pattern." I said, "Tell me." He said, "They don't win because they're stronger. They win because they've studied the species they're fighting. They've done this enough times that they have a model of how any biological entity responds to threat. The model isn't perfect, but it's very good. They use it to predict what you'll do, and then they position themselves to be where your response takes you. Both the previous champions were very good fighters. They did exactly what very good fighters do. And Keth was already there, already waiting." I said, "So what they need is someone who doesn't fight like a fighter." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's one way to put it." He said, "We've been going through records. Combat records, medical records, psychological assessments. We're looking for someone who has been in enough bad situations to have their responses reorganized. People who have been in scenarios where the standard responses didn't work and survival required something else. Someone who has been, and I'm using a clinical term here, so thoroughly exposed to threat that the threat response itself has been retrained." I said, "You're looking for someone who's been broken in the right way." Another pause. He said, "The selection committee would phrase it differently." I said, "I know how they'd phrase it." He said, "I want to be clear about what I'm asking." I said, "You don't have to be. I understood the moment I got the message." I drove north the next morning. Kepi I left with my nearest neighbor, a woman named Aino who was 72 and had lived alone since her husband died, and who received the request with the practicality of someone who had learned, over a long life, not to ask for explanations that wouldn't make sense anyway. She looked at me for a moment with the directness of the very old and the very honest and said, "You look the way my husband looked the morning he left for the Second War, and I'll tell you what I told him, which is that the thing you're carrying is heavier than the thing you're walking toward." I didn't have an answer for that. I held her hand for a moment, which is not something I do easily, and got back in the truck. The road north passes through several hours of the kind of forest that has been there long enough to stop caring about roads. In autumn, it is orange and gold and dark gray and smells of cold water. I drove through it thinking about nothing particular, which is what I do when I need to think about something, and know the direct approach won't work. I thought about Kepi's face when I'd handed her over, the particular confusion of a dog who trusts you completely and therefore cannot understand why you are doing a clearly wrong thing. I thought about Aino's husband and what he had been carrying. I thought about the flask the Chinese fighter had passed to his second with that specific small smile, and what it means to walk into something you cannot survive and carry a small warm thing with you as far as it will go. The staging area was 2 converted military facilities and a field of temporary structures that had gone up in 72 hours. There were people everywhere, military, scientific, governmental, media at the perimeter. There was noise. The noise of large numbers of humans who are frightened and organized and trying to make those 2 things compatible. I had been in spaces like this before. They have a particular texture. The smell of too much coffee and too little sleep. The sound of communication devices going constantly. The way people move when they're trying to project competence because projecting competence is the only thing holding the space together. I checked in. I met the committee. I met Imre in person, small, disheveled, eyes that moved fast and landed on things with precision. He walked me through what they knew and what they thought they knew and what they were guessing. I said, "I want to watch the footage again, all of it." I watched it 3 times. I watched Keth the way I used to watch a trauma patient in the first seconds, looking for the system, looking for the pattern, looking for what was load-bearing and what was compensatory, and what was going to become a problem if you didn't address it. And I saw something. It's hard to explain what I saw to someone who hasn't spent years watching bodies fail. Medicine teaches you a particular attention to movement, not the movement someone is making, but the movement the body is organized around. The base state, the resting preference, where the weight goes when nothing particular is happening. Keth moved when she wasn't in active challenge in a way that told me something about her biology. The long reach. The way the sensory cluster oriented not toward light, the way human faces orient but toward heat signatures and motion differentials. The way she positioned before a challenge began, the slight lateral rotation that put her primary sensory array facing slightly left of center. The crystallized force weapon she carried was an extension of her reach, but it was also a tell. She oriented her reach. She was not omnidirectional. There was a direction she led with and a direction she compensated for. I didn't know what to do with that, not yet. I asked Imre for anything they had on Veth biology. He gave me 4 hours of files and the data the third champion had relayed, which included a reading of the weapon's harmonic output and the associated resonance in Keth's own body. The way she and the weapon were tuned to each other, the micro-adjustments she made in real time. I read them the way I used to read emergency patient files, fast, selective, looking for the decision-relevant material, and setting the rest aside without losing it. What I found: the Veth have a bilateral asymmetry in their threat response system that mirrors their bilateral asymmetry in their sensory array. When a threat appears on the left side of their perceptual field, the response is faster, more aggressive, and critically more committed, less responsive to recalculation. When the threat appears on the right, the response is slower but more adaptive. This was a biological vulnerability, not a physical one, a perceptual one. I also found something else in the files that I sat with for a long time in the small room they'd given me, while the noise of the staging area continued outside. The Veth believe, functionally, that a species under sufficient threat will always reveal its essential nature. Challenge enough, and you see what something truly is. Every challenge they'd issued on every world they'd documented had proceeded from this assumption. They pushed. The species responded from whatever it was at its core. The Veth read that core response, assessed it, and made their determination. They had never encountered a species that had been, at its core, so thoroughly acquainted with the end of things that the end of things had stopped meaning what it means to something that hasn't lived inside it. I sat in that small room and I thought about the corridor, about the 11 months, about what the prison doctors had called, in their very careful language in the tribunal documents, a fundamental reorganization of the fear response. About the way Imre had said broken in the right way and then immediately walked it back. I thought about what Aino had said about what I was carrying. Then I went to find the committee and told them what I was going to do. They argued with me for 2 hours. Then they agreed because they had nothing else. The challenge ground was a flat expanse north of the tree line, roughly circular, approximately 100 meters across. The Veth had cleared it in ways I didn't ask about. The ground was hard and pale, and the sky above it was the particular deep gray of a Finnish autumn morning, low cloud cover, no wind. 3 of the Veth's carried houses were visible on the horizon, their shapes still wrong to the eye, still requiring that extra half-second of processing. Keth was already there when I arrived. She was standing in the center of the clearing. Still, in that particular Veth stillness that isn't rest but readiness, the system at idle, consuming minimal resources, every input channel open. She was not performing. She was not posturing. She was simply present in the way that the very top of a predatory hierarchy can afford to be present, without the constant vigilance that marks everything below it. The crystallized weapon was across her back. In the gray light, it threw no shadow at all. Her primary sensory array was oriented straight forward, toward the direction I would approach from. She had done this 8 times before on 8 worlds. She knew what came next. She had the kind of certainty that comes from never having been wrong. I walked to the edge of the challenge space and stopped. The protocol, as Tanaka had explained it, was formal. There were declarations. There was a moment of acknowledgement between the parties, then a signal, and the challenge began. I didn't listen to most of the declarations. I was watching Keth, watching the primary sensory array, watching the weight distribution, watching the small adjustments she made as she tracked my entry into the space. There was a moment, one specific moment, as I crossed the midpoint between the clearing edge and the center, where the sensory array rotated slightly left, orienting toward me. The weapon shifted on her back. The weight moved forward onto the forward limbs. She had read me as the type of threat she knew. That was the assessment. That was what every challenger had given her, a person walking into a challenge space carrying the intention to fight. The body gives it away before the body does anything. The set of the shoulders, the focus of the attention. The particular kind of readiness that is really just organized aggression looking for a direction. I wasn't giving her that. I was giving her something I had learned in the corridor, where aggression had got me hurt for the first 3 months until I understood that aggression was what the guards were reading, what the entire system was calibrated to detect and respond to. What worked, what had eventually got me through 11 months and out the other side, was something harder to maintain than aggression. It was the opposite of combat readiness. It was a kind of radical openness, a state in which the body has accepted that it is inside a situation it cannot fight its way out of and has found, instead, a way to persist. It looks, to someone who is calibrated to read threat, like nothing. I had walked in looking like nothing, not passive, not defeated, not afraid, just present, a body occupying space, a system in a genuine resting state which is almost impossible to fake because it requires the absence of something that most people can't entirely turn off. Keth's weight shifted back. The sensory array reoriented, scanning left and right of me, checking for a second threat source, because what her system was telling her didn't match her model for what a challenger looked like. She looked at me. I looked at her. I was humming very quietly, something my mother used to sing while she cooked, not a war song, not anything powerful, just a domestic fragment of something old and West African, and full of the specific warmth of a kitchen in the morning. I was not doing it to make a point. I was doing it because it was the thing that kept the corridor state accessible, the memory of something safe enough to make the body believe, just partially, that the world outside the present threat was still real. A scrap of the life outside the machine, the thing you held onto when the machine was telling you that nothing outside it existed. The signal came. Keth moved. I need to describe what happened carefully, because what happened was not what it looked like from the outside, and the outside reports mostly got it wrong. Keth's initial move was an assessment move, not a killing blow, a probing action designed to see how I responded. She came in from my right, well within the range of her weapon, angling to create a lateral threat that would push me either backward or hard left, into her leading sensory field, into the committed response. I did neither. I moved in, not toward her exactly, in and slightly right, closing the distance and going to the side she was compensating toward, the right side, the slower, more adaptive side, the side the harmonic data said she loaded last. What I was doing was not a fighting technique. It was a medical one. In field surgery, when you're working in a space that is too small and someone needs to move, you don't push, you step into the space you need until the other body accommodates. You don't create a conflict. You create a fact. You are already here. You have already moved. The space has already changed. Keth's committed response had already fired. It was going to the space I had been. I wasn't there. She recalibrated. Right side response, slower, more adaptive. I had a fraction of a second in which she was in mid-recalculation. I didn't attack. I'm not a fighter. I've never been a fighter. What I did was put my hand on her right limb, the reaching limb, the weapon limb, and I held it, not fighting the strength of it, not trying to contain it. Just establishing contact and going with the direction it was already moving, adding nothing and removing nothing. The way you hold a patient down without restraining them, with your weight rather than your grip. She stopped. This is the part that the footage shows but doesn't explain. Keth stopped completely. Not the tactical pause of a recalibration. Something else. The sensory array oriented toward the point of contact. The weapon, which had been active, according to the instruments the scientific team had positioned around the perimeter, operating at full harmonic output, went quiet. There was no sound in the clearing, no wind. The gray light sat on us both and didn't move. I held contact for maybe 3 seconds. Then I stepped back to my original position and waited. Keth did not move for a long time. When she moved, it was not a challenge move. She turned her primary sensory array toward me and held it there, and then she made a sound I had not heard in any of the recordings. A low, multitonal sound that Tanaka, watching from the perimeter, later said she had no translation for, that it was something that didn't appear in any of their Veth linguistic records. Then Keth turned and walked back to her side of the clearing. The challenge, by Veth protocol, requires one party to yield or one party to be unable to continue. Keth had yielded. The Veth Council observed this for a very long time in silence. I didn't understand what had happened, not then, not fully. What I understood, driving back south 2 days later, was that I was alive and that the challenge was over and that the Veth were, according to Tanaka's most recent communication, engaged in what their protocol called a full reassessment, which she described as something between a scientific review and an existential crisis. I understood that I was tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion, the kind of tired that comes after you've held a certain state of being for too long, the corridor state, which costs something different than effort costs. It costs the distance you've been keeping between yourself and the thing you went through. Holding that state for the challenge had meant reaching back into the corridor and finding it intact, finding the self that had learned to persist inside it and borrowing it for an hour, and then setting it back down. I stopped the truck on the road north of my house and sat for a while watching the tree line. The forest was quiet in the way a forest gets when the wrong thing has left. I called Imre on the satellite phone. He said before I could speak, "I've been watching the footage for 6 hours and I still can't fully explain what I'm seeing." I said, "I know." He said, "The committee wants a full debrief. They want to use what happened as the basis for a contact protocol. They think this changes everything." I said, "It changes some things." He said, "The Veth have requested to send observers. They want to study you." I said, "Tell them they can ask." He said more quietly, "What was it like?" I thought about it. I thought about Keth's stillness before the challenge. The particular quality of it, the absence of fear that wasn't arrogance, just the genuine condition of something that had not yet encountered the thing that would make it afraid. I thought about the moment when I touched her limb and she stopped, and the look of the sensory array orienting toward the contact, the slow quality of that attention, like something encountering a language it didn't have words for. I said, "She's very good at what she does." He waited. I said, "She stopped because she didn't know what I was doing." And she didn't know what I was doing because I barely know what I'm doing. Whatever the corridor turned me into, it's not something I'd choose. It's not something I'd recommend. But it's apparently something that 4,000 years of Veth challenge protocol hadn't encountered before. Emre said, "Is that why she froze?" I said, "I think so, but I'm not sure that's all of it." It wasn't all of it. I found out the rest 3 months later, in the first extended exchange session with the Veth scientist who had been assigned to study the challenge. She communicated through a resonance interface that Tanaka had helped to calibrate, and the communication was slow and partial and required a great deal of careful back and forth. But over the course of several sessions, she gave me what I needed to understand what I had not understood. The Veth's model for sentient species includes a prediction about what happens to a species under the maximum stress of a mortal challenge. The model is very good, as I said. It is based on observation. It correctly predicts, with high reliability, the core behavioral signature that emerges when a species is pushed to its absolute limit. The prediction for humanity, based on all available data, was aggression, fight-response. The behavioral signature of a species that is physically capable enough to believe, at its core, that fighting back is the answer. What Keth found in me was not that. What Keth found was something that looked to her perceptual system like the behavioral signature of something that had already died and kept going anyway, not because it was undead, not because it was malfunctioning, but because at some point, whatever I had been through had rearranged the order of operations, had moved survival instinct to the front and removed aggression from the chain entirely, replaced it with something slower and stranger and much harder to read. The Veth word for it, the scientist told me, is a single glyph that they use to describe a particular geological phenomenon, a stone that has been in a river so long that it no longer has edges. You cannot cut with it. You cannot use it as a weapon. You cannot erode it, because erosion is already what made it. It is the hardest thing in the river not because it resists the river, but because it has become, at some molecular level, continuous with the water. She said, in 4,000 years and on 9 worlds, Keth had never looked at a challenger and seen that. She said she froze because her threat model had no category for it. And then she yielded because her threat model, which is the thing she trusts most, told her that she did not know what she was dealing with, and Keth's deepest training is this. When you do not know what you are dealing with, you stop. She said, the council has been arguing about what this means, about what you are and whether it changes their assessment of humanity. I asked, what does it mean? She was quiet for a moment in the particular way the Veth are quiet. Total, deliberate, information-carrying silence. She said, it means that you are not what we expected. We expected a species that fights because it has not been destroyed. We found a species that persists because it has been destroyed and built itself back around the destruction and kept going. These are different things. The second thing is she paused, harder to model, harder to contain, harder to assess. She said, the council has no protocol for species that continue to function at the site of their own damage. I thought about that for a long time. I thought about it the morning after the exchange session, getting up at 5 to make coffee, watching the light change across the tree line. Kepi was back, unhappy about her time with Aino, and making it known in the small, persistent ways of animals with opinions. I gave her her food and scratched behind her ears, and she pressed her head against my knee in that ungainly, total way she has that makes it impossible to feel only one thing. The scientist, whose name I eventually learned to approximate as Kethvel, which carries more meaning in Veth than the sound suggests, something about observation and patience combined in a way that doesn't map cleanly to any English word, continued to come to the exchange sessions. She came not as a researcher after the 4th session, but as something more like a peer. She asked questions I didn't always know how to answer. I asked questions she didn't always know how to answer. We were both, in our different ways, operating outside our models. One morning she asked me about the humming. She had reviewed the challenge footage and identified it, the thermal signature of my vocal output, too low to register as significant sound but measurable with the instruments the Veth had positioned around the clearing. Present from the moment I entered, not intermittent, continuous or nearly so. I told her about my mother's kitchen, about the specific light in the morning in the house where I grew up, before the Sahel, before all of it, the way it came through a curtain made of some thin material that turned it orange and gold, and the smell of the food and the sound of my mother's voice carrying something old through the movement of cooking, and how that fragment of warmth had become, in the corridor, the thing I held onto when everything else was being systematically removed. A scrap of evidence that there was a world outside the machine, something the machine couldn't take because it didn't know it was there. She was quiet for a long time. Then she communicated something that the translator rendered with visible uncertainty, flagging a non-standard usage. She said that in all the worlds they had assessed, in all the challenges and all the observations, they had catalogued the things species used as weapons, as shields, as tools of survival, physical tools, tactical tools, even psychological ones, war cries, territorial displays, chemical markers of aggression. She said we had not catalogued comfort. She set it down there in the middle of the exchange, the way you set something fragile down very carefully, and left it. I thought about Keth, standing in the challenge ground in the gray morning, with 9 worlds of certainty, and a weapon made of shaped force, and a model that had never failed her, and a human being in front of her who was humming something his dead mother used to sing while she cooked. I thought about what the model must have looked like trying to process that. The gap between what it was built to find and what it found. The freeze that follows not fear but genuine epistemological failure, when the architecture of your certainty encounters something it was not built to hold and stops, not because it is broken, but because it is honest. The world outside had not gotten simpler. The Veth were still here. 17 carried houses. The assessment had been paused, but paused wasn't resolved, and Tanaka was clear that a pause was all it was. There would be more conversations, more protocols, more of the slow, difficult work of 2 species trying to find the edges of what they had in common and what they didn't, and whether that gap was bridgeable. There would be more Darius Okaforce, I suspected. More people pulled out of quiet places because of what the world had made them, drafted into service precisely because of the damage, asked to carry their own wreckage across a challenge ground as if it were a credential. I didn't know how I felt about that. It seemed both right and wrong in ways that I couldn't fully separate. Wrong because what the corridor cost is not something that should be converted into a resource. Right because, and this is the part I keep coming back to, what the corridor cost was already paid. It was already in me, already part of the structure, already part of whatever I am now. If it turns out to be useful, that doesn't make the cost smaller. It makes the cost something other than purely waste. I don't know if that makes it better. I think about it. What I know is this. The world the Veth had built their expectations on was a world where the thing that defines a species under ultimate threat is the pure, unmodified version of itself. Its core, its essence, the thing it is when everything else is stripped away. They had stripped everything away and found something they didn't expect. They found the stone in the river. They found what the corridor had made. They found what 11 months of systematic attempt at erasure had produced, which was not erasure but a kind of compression. Everything essential pushed down to a smaller space and made denser, made continuous with the damage, made into something that could sit in a challenge ground in the gray finish morning, and hold the hand of the thing that had come to end it and mean no harm and no submission, just, I am here, and I have been here before in worse versions of this, and I am still going. I am still going. That's the part they didn't have in their model. They have it now. Kethvel asked me, in one of the last sessions before the exchange program moved to a formal diplomatic structure, and I was relieved from it, whether I was afraid during the challenge. I thought about it honestly. I said yes. She asked, what did you do with it? I said, the same thing I always do. I put it somewhere I could find it later and let it run in the background, and did what needed doing in the foreground. She considered this. She asked, is that a common human ability? I thought about the Sahel, about the operating table in the field hospital, about the people who kept working under incoming fire because the patient on the table needed them to keep working, about Renée Suzillo setting her jaw and walking into the clearing for a second time, about the Chinese fighter passing his flask and smiling before walking into something he wasn't expected to survive. I said, more common than most species probably know. She said, the council is afraid of you. I said, I know. She said, not of your weapons, not of your numbers or your technology, afraid of the particular thing you just described. She said, a species that can carry its fear in one hand and keep working with the other is a species we do not have a protocol for. It is, she said, using their word for the category, a species that is structurally uncontainable. Not because it is powerful, because it is, she searched for the right mapping, continuous, connected at the roots in ways that are not visible on the surface. Damage one part and the rest keeps going and adapts. She said, we have been assessing sentient species for 4,000 years. We have a category for aggressive, for submissive, for clever, for enduring. We did not have a category for what you are. I poured the coffee and I thought about that. Kepi's head on my knee, Aino and her husband's flask, a kitchen, morning light, a song without a title, all the things that don't go in the model because the model looks for weapons, and these things don't look like weapons. I said, I didn't know what I was doing when I did it. Kethvel said, we know, that is the part that concerns us most. The exchange program formalized. Diplomats replaced me. The Veth installed a permanent communications installation near the Greenland landing site, and 3 teams of humans began the enormous, slow work of learning each other properly. Tanaka led the science side. 2 of the 3 champions who had survived were involved, in different capacities. The world got used, in the way the world always eventually gets used to things, to the fact of the Veth on the horizon. I went back to Finland. The coffee, the wood, the light on the trees in the morning, Kepi on the floor. Kethvel sent a communication, through the official channels, 3 months after I got back. It was brief. It said, translated through several intermediaries who I suspect got it mostly right. The Council has completed its reassessment. The finding is that humanity is not a client species. I held the phone for a moment. The finding continued. Humanity is designated as an adjacent species, the closest Veth category to the concept of an equal that their formal protocol allows. The challenge record is being added to their documentation of species they have encountered. The notation in their language reads something close to species that has learned to carry its wounds as architecture, proceed with caution and with respect. This is not a species that fights. This is a species that remains. I read it 3 times. Then I put the phone in my pocket and went outside and stood in the cold morning air and listened to the forest, which was just a forest, full of ordinary things going about their ordinary lives without any knowledge of the conversation I had just been part of. A stone in a river. Still there. Still going. There is a thing that happens in medicine when a patient who should not have survived does. The body, pushed past the edge of what should be recoverable, sometimes reorganizes. The system shifts resources, compensates, builds bridges around the damage instead of through it. The patient lives, but they live differently, carrying the scar tissue not just in their flesh, but in the architecture of how they function, how they respond, how they metabolize stress. Doctors have clinical names for it. Patients have their own words, usually quieter ones. I was thinking about this late one evening in the second winter after the Veth arrived, sitting with Kepi and a cup of tea that had gone cold, while I read through the draft of a paper Imre had sent me. He was trying to formalize what had happened in the clearing into a framework that could be taught. He was thorough and intelligent, and he was getting parts of it right, and the parts he was getting right were the parts that could be made explicit. The physiology of the right side approach, the harmonic data from the weapon, the calculated probability improvements. The parts he couldn't get right were the parts that couldn't be made explicit. How do you teach the corridor? How do you teach the moment when a person realizes that fighting the machine is feeding the machine, and that the only thing the machine cannot process is something that doesn't participate in its logic? How do you teach the particular, hard-won quality of someone who has been dissolved down to their minimum viable self, and found that self still there, still running, still generating warmth in its small ways, while the structure was being stripped from around it? You don't teach it. You don't teach it because it isn't a technique. It's a condition. You arrive at it through experiences no sane person would choose to arrange for themselves. But Emre wanted a framework. The committee wanted a protocol. The diplomats wanted a repeatable approach, and I understood why. There were things coming. Not from the Veth specifically. The Veth were now in a category that at least had some stability, but from whatever else was out there, because if the Veth had found us, others would too, and some of those others would be less interested in reassessment than in simply proceeding with the original plan. I thought about the Chinese fighter with his flask. I thought about what it means to walk into a thing you probably won't survive and take a small, warm moment with you, not because it will help, not tactically, but because the carrying of it is itself a statement about what you are. I wrote back to Emre. I said, the framework isn't about the technique. The framework is about what the technique points toward. I said, you're looking for people who have been inside a system designed to end them and found a way to remain. Not survive. Remain. The distinction matters. I said, survival implies winning. Remaining implies something else. It implies that the self has found a way to continue being present at the site of its own difficulty. That it hasn't left. That it hasn't dissociated or gone somewhere safe inside itself while the outside takes the damage. It has stayed fully, impossibly present in the worst possible space and not been consumed. I said, the Veth model reads presence as intention, aggressive presence as threat, submissive presence as yield. They had never encountered presence with no agenda beyond persistence. I said, you can't manufacture that. But you can look for the people who already have it and ask them to carry what they carry into the rooms where it matters. And you can listen to what they tell you, because the people who have been there and come back have things to say about the topology of the inside of very bad situations that you cannot learn any other way. I sent the message and put the phone down and drank the cold tea and thought about what Kethvel had said. A species that can carry its fear in one hand and keep working with the other. I thought about all the people I had known who could do that. The medics who kept moving in the Sahel when movement should have been impossible. The nurses in the corridor who had not been taken with the hospital but who came back anyway, came back to try to reach the patient still inside, because leaving felt to them like the wrong thing, and they had a strong sense of wrong things. The patients themselves, in both places, who told me things about endurance that I had studied in textbooks and been told in lectures, and had not understood until I heard them from the inside. They were not exceptional people in the sense that exceptionality is usually meant. They were not the ones at the top of the hierarchy, the fastest and the strongest and the most celebrated. They were the ordinary humans who had found themselves in extraordinary extremity and had made a particular choice. Not the heroic choice, not the defiant choice, but the quiet, almost boring choice to keep going because going was what they knew how to do and stopping was not a language they had fully learned. The world was full of them. The Veth had no idea. The Veth had been assessing the top end of our performance metrics, the champions, the warriors, the designated representatives. They had been reading the species from its best fighters. It had not occurred to them, in 4,000 years of methodology, to read a species from its most ordinary persisters, the people who have no particular strength except that they have never fully stopped. That is what I tried to write in the message to Emre. That cold evening, with Kepi's head on my foot and the forest dark and quiet outside. I don't know how much of it translated into the formal framework. I know that the framework exists now and that it is used, and that the people selected under it tend to look different from the people who are usually selected for things. Less polished, more worn. The kind of worn that is not degradation but accumulation, the specific texture of a self that has been through several things and carried all of them forward. Kethvel told me, in our last session, that the Veth had begun to study human history from a new angle. Not from the angle of our conflicts, they already had that data, the wars and the technologies and the catastrophic periodic collapses and recoveries, but from the angle of what persisted through the conflicts, what carried itself forward through all of it. She said, "We did not understand what your history is for." She said, "We thought it was a record of how you fought. We have been revising that. We think it is a record of how you remained." She said, "There is a difference and we did not see it." I said, "Most of us don't see it either." She said, "You see it." I said, "I see it because I've been in the part of it that isn't recorded. The ordinary middle part, where nothing heroic is happening, and people are just doing the next thing because the next thing needs doing. That's most of it, actually. The heroic parts are small. The keeping going parts are the whole length of it." She was quiet. Then she said, "That is what we will put in our records, not the challenge, not the outcome. We will put in our records what a human told us about the keeping going parts." I said, "Make sure you get the coffee in there, and the dog." She took a moment with the translation. Then she made the sound that I had learned over many sessions, was how she expressed something in the neighborhood of amusement. I poured the coffee, still hot, still the right temperature, still the first clear thing of the morning. The light was coming up over the trees. Kepi's tail moved once in her sleep. Outside, far north, the shape of the carried house was still on the horizon, wrong and patient and no longer quite as threatening as it had been. We were still here. The world was still here. The river was still going, and in it, smooth and continuous and nowhere near eroded out of itself, was every human being who had ever sat in the wreckage of something and decided to make coffee in the morning anyway. The stone in the river. Remaining.